From Bitcoin, blockchain or distributed ledger technology to cryptocurrencies, tokens and initial coin offerings, it seems everyone involved has something to say, but can you really trust their advice? One man's had enough of weasel words and charlatans and is ready to give you impartial, independent analysis. With digestible blockchain bytes, ICO analysis and need-to-know news on cryptocurrencies, author, speaker, transparency and clarity advocate and award-winning software innovator Barry James brings you Radio ICO.
Hello, I'm Barry James here again for ICORadio. This is the Blockchain Bytes series, and I'm delighted to be at an event put on by my guest here, Jonny Fry, and at the offices of DLA Piper. Jonny, would you just introduce yourself a little and tell us what the event is and what it's about?
Sure. My name is Jonny Fry. I'm the CEO of a company called Team Blockchain. Team Blockchain is a company that has been helping a number of companies look at the challenges and opportunities around blockchain. And in particular in the last year, we've been actually helping companies, advising them on when they could, perhaps when they shouldn't be actually doing an ICO. So this is I think the sixth version now that we've done of ICO meetups. They start off with 20, 30 people. Tonight we've got over 200 people registered to attend. And there are a variety of professional investors, accountants, lawyers, and people generally involved in the sort of crypto space in Europe as well as London. Tonight's theme is really one of trying to get a perspective of ICOs from different nationalities. So we're delighted we've got a representative from Emergo, which is part of the Cardano, which is the fifth biggest cryptocurrency in the world, which I'm sure your listeners will be aware of. They're the venture capital arm based in Japan, recently set up an office here in London, and they're going to be giving us a perspective from a Japanese point of view about ICOs. We also have Crypto Vault, which based in Switzerland, so they'll be looking at ICOs from the Swiss perspective. And then we have Corona Networks, which is a New York-based ICO, recently successfully raised some capital, and they'll be actually looking at from an African perspective and how ICOs could affect the continent. Myself will be doing a brief overview of the ICO market and how we see it evolving based on the conversations we're having with local authorities, public companies, central governments. And then finally, a colleague of mine, Gary Nuttall, will be talking about some of the common queries, myths, misunderstandings around blockchain, because we're finding we're doing quite a lot of training for professional advisors and also corporates to help them understand where they could and should or may want to use blockchain as a technology.
Okay, and where did you come in? How did you get involved in the field?
Well, my background is really asset management. I actually set up a asset management company literally from a bedroom back in the 80s, 85, 86. And then that business evolved and went on, and we acquired Brewing Dolphins Unit Trust Company back in the 90s, and then set up a number of CCAVs and structured products out of the Channel Islands, in Luxembourg, used in the Isle of Man with Robert Fleming, in Ireland. We then actually got involved with a company called Mackenzie Financial Corporation. They became a shareholder because by that stage we'd actually floated the business on the London stock market. And then we set a range of funds up in Canada and North America working with them. So I was CEO of that business for over 20 years. So it was a regulated business and it was a quoted business. So I had two lots of regulations along with HMRC and the VAT man, all that fun and games. So I suppose I've come into this very much looking at it from a regulatory purpose and looking at some structure and some standards, because there seems to be a lot of ICOs or a lot of people that want to do ICOs, and there's some very, very bright Eastern Europeans, Indians, Americans. They've got one or two or three PhDs in some cases, but they've got very little experience of running a business. So the way we've seen the market evolve over the last year is this time last year, if you raised 5 million, you're doing really, really well. There was no KYC, there was no AML, the white papers were maybe a dozen pages if you're lucky. And then you saw it evolve and move, and now we're seeing much more serious businesses. Interesting to see announced in the paper this morning that George Soros has become an investor in a company called Overstock, which is a publicly quoted company. And that's the fifth company that's publicly quoted that has announced its intentions to get involved in this space. The first European one was a company called Naga, where they raised 40 million euros off of 50,000 people. We've had an announcement from Nostrum, which is a Spanish restaurant company, and they're going to raise 40 million euros. Glance Technologies in Canada, they've announced they're going to do an ICO. And then obviously we saw Kodak recently announce they're going to get involved in this space. But out of all of them, the one that I find particularly interesting was the announcement from the chairman of Starbucks 5 weeks ago, where he actually brought the conversation up by saying, we are not going to do a Starbucks coin yet. The reason I'm actually bringing this conversation up or the subject up, is because we have a duty to look at the future for our customers and for the company. And off the back of that, we'll be actually launching our first cashless Starbucks in, I think it's Q2 in America. So we see very much the ICO space. There's been a lot of sort of get rich quick, raise loads of money, and I think perhaps the general perception is Bitcoin, blockchain, they're all the same, and all of these things are ponces and scams, and look, there's been a lot of money. There's been 5 billion last year, with fresh capital came into this market. It completely annihilated the venture capital market in the blockchain space by 5 to 1. So yes, you're always going to attract some nefarious activities, let's say. But what we're seeing now is more mature existing businesses, local authorities, and central governments wanting to use the principle, the concept, the technology behind initial coin offerings to actually raise money. And then I think what we're going to start seeing is then companies not raising money, but using them as a way to capture your imagination, to keep your attention, a digital engagement. So for those of your listeners who perhaps the wrong side of 40, they'll remember Green Shield stamps. So we see this as a digital version of Green Shield stamps, whereby you talk to many, many marketing people, they'll tell you the cost of engaging, the cost of actually acquiring a client is roughly $100. So instead of actually spending $100 on advertising at the Super Bowl or on ITV or perhaps the pages of whatever paper you wish to try and attract the target market, they'll probably give away $70 or $80 worth of coins, of tokens, and then they'll be able to exchange and move those tokens because these things are traded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
So is this going to change the way business works?
I think it's going to totally transform the business works. The reason I feel that way is that having had personal experience of running an asset management business and actually trying to invest in smaller companies, there is just no liquidity. Unless your company's worth 300 or 400 million, trying to raise money in the stock market is extremely difficult. It's a real specialist skill with specialist contact knowledge, and that then makes it very, very difficult to fund a business. And given this financial situation of many, many banks all over the world, they're trying to recapitalise themselves. They don't have a huge thirst and desire to actually lend money to small startups. So the initial coin offerings have given a real fill-up to innovative new technology. A lot of it is based around blockchain, but by no means all of it. And we're beginning to see some very, very innovative products. I'm helping a company, for example, at the moment. What they want to do is they want to take £100 million worth of $100 million, and instead of giving the shareholders, the unit holders, the investors shares or units, they actually want to give them tokens. But the money will be 100% invested in property. And then as they get the rental income off the property, they will then give back in either Bitcoin or Ethereum. Now the reason they're doing that is because the target market is saying we want to get involved in the cryptocurrency space, but we hate the volatility. So basically their money is going to go direct into property, but it'll be accounted for and traded potentially 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in a cryptocurrency. Because many people forget that they think, the markets are very, very liquid. The markets, whether that's the foreign exchange market, whether it's the equity market, whether it's the commodity market, basically it shuts around about 9 o'clock GMT when Wall Street shuts. And then it opens again sometimes Sunday sort of evening when Japan opens. So all day Saturday it's shut, apart from obviously people buy and sell houses. But therefore asset prices can suddenly fall dramatically on a Friday night to Sunday afternoon, and you can't get out. You're stuck. So cryptocurrencies give an opportunity to be able to trade through if required.
So given that if what you say is right, and I don't disagree, as you'll probably have gathered by now, and it is going to change the business landscape. If I'm a business owner or a business leader, this isn't easy stuff to get your head around. I mean, famously we have the rabbit hole metaphor.
Cold bullets.
What would be your advice to a business leader or a business owner?
Well, I think tonight is a testament for the thirst for information and thirst for knowledge. We're doing a couple of presentations for another. To be honest, it's a small lawyer in the West End of London, and they've had over 3 times the number of people register to come to their technology 6-monthly briefing because they want to hear about initial coin offerings. And I think in terms of, it's like everything, the best bet is to get involved. Go out and spend £100 of your money and open up a wallet, and just understand how unbelievably difficult it is with a massive long private key code number which you'll probably forget within the first week, so you've lost £100. So therefore that's what you're going to ask potential participants in your business to be exposed to. Is that something you want them to do? I think the other big thing we have to look at is, as a shareholder of a business, you have to look at it and say, well, what are the conflicts between a shareholder and a token holder? Many people haven't really sort of had that conversation yet. What are the tax complications? Now, I was talking to someone last night and he said, well, don't worry, I don't have to pay tax until I convert it into fiat, i.e. dollars, euros, sterling. Well, I'm sorry, that's just not correct. You go and talk to the HMRC and you say, well, I'm a company, I've just raised 20 million, how are you treating that? And they say, well, we treat it as income. And I said, well, if you're going to treat it as income, does that mean I've now got to have a full audit because I've gone through the 10 million threshold under the Companies Act? And they said, oh, no. And then the partner or his colleague turned to me at the HMRC and said, no, we treat it as capital. So you can see even within the HMRC they're not quite sure because we're still feeling our way in some of these aspects.
Yeah.
But just get involved. There's lots and lots and lots on the internet. There's something in the national press almost every day. There's something on the radio almost every day about this subject. So don't take anyone's word for it. Not even your lawyer, not even your accountant, because they're learning as well.
Yeah.
And just do your research. I think that's the biggest thing.
But in terms of strategy, should I be worried? Does an ICO mean that my business sector could be decentralized? Perhaps I should be thinking about that.
I wouldn't be worried, but I wouldn't ignore it, because, as I've already said, we've got 5-6 quoted companies that are now moving into this sort of space, and they're looking at it as a way in which they can try and engage with their clients. If we go back to the digital loyalty schemes for a moment, in America, what happens is that American Express gives away reward points when you spend money on their credit card. That creates a contingent liability. In the US alone, there's $300 billion worth of loyalty credits a year. That's 300 billion potential contingent liability. Now, the way they account for it is, it's fairly commonly known, less than a third of people actually redeem their loyalty points. I'm sure, like I've got some Club Cub points, and I've got some Waitrose points, and I've got my Air Miles and Avios and all the other bits and pieces. No idea. Got lots and lots and lots. But nevertheless, they are sitting on companies' balance sheets. Yeah. So if you've got a super effective marketing guy, as we saw with Air Miles, who then went on and sponsored the America's Cup, so he made so much money out of the idea. The more successful he is in his marketing, the bigger the liability is on the company's balance sheet. So the actual poorer, or the extra decrease in value that company is suffering. Now, if that company can move that liability off its balance sheet and set up a digital token to give you an excuse to engage with your client, to give them rewards, an excuse to come back and look at your website, to buy your products with other people, and that thing is exchangeable, not just, I'll have a Virgin Air Miles or I'll have Club Car points in Tesco's. It gives you the ability to say, no, I'm going to switch it, perhaps my Facebook coin for Starbucks coin. Yeah. Because believe you me, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. So it has this in common perhaps with crowdfunding. It's a different kind of relationship with the people we used to call consumers.
Well, it's interesting, because I think if the way it'll possibly go is that some of these token companies could become bigger than the quoted companies that they've issued them. And so then the token companies could take over the quoted companies, and then what you end up with is, in effect, a cooperative, because the token holders own the business that spawned them. Now that is quite interesting in terms of how but nothing's new, is it? Cooperatives have been around before PLCs.
Yeah.
So it's not going to happen overnight, but you can be certain that some of your competitors are thinking about it, looking at it. But it's a number of people said it's free money because it's not debt, it's not equity dilution. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And if anyone tries to give me this is the very thing, you must do it, it's not for every company by any means. But it's certainly something which I would wholeheartedly recommend. Just go and listen, find out, ask the very obvious questions, ask the stupid questions, because often those questions are the very, very best questions when it's relevant to your business.
Yeah. And I understand you're one of the co-founders of Team Blockchain.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that? What's that?
Well, as I said, Team Blockchain really was a business set up a couple of years ago now to try and help people understand a little bit more about the technology of blockchain and where it was and where it wasn't appropriate and suitable. We've got a number of consultants that come from different sort of specialisms. So it might be in logistics, it might be in insurance, it might be in banking, it might be in media. And the object really was to act really as a catalyst to get people to start talking and exchanging ideas, as almost like a thought leadership think tank to help people through this sort of confusion of what is this technology. A lot of people think, oh, it's a brand new technology. Well, it's not. One of the I was at lunch today with a company in the media industry, and they were saying, I can't really understand it. What's it all about? And I said, do you know what Napster is? He said, of course I know what Napster is. I said, that was the distributed ledger technology. In effect, it was file sharing. So it's been around for a long, long time, the technology. But what we've now seen is the classic fear and greed. I fear that you're losing out and you might be able to do something. Greed, you've seen Ripple go up 37,000% last year. And everyone says, oh yeah, but it's all collapsed, it's all disappeared. Well, no, actually, since in the last month, Ethereum is actually up, not down.
Yeah.
So it hasn't all gone down, but the point is, it shouldn't really be about making money per se.
Yeah. And
if people are going to chase and try and find the next big thing, I think you should look at the equity markets, which, as I say, I've been involved in those for nearly 30 years, and it's been proved statistically that a blindfolded monkey throwing a dart has as much chance of outperforming and picking a stock than you do. Yeah. 2/3 of fund managers don't beat the index.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing we will see. We're going to start seeing more and more funds at a retail level actually investing in cryptocurrencies. So that may be something much more suitable for people rather than trying to pick the next big thing. Yeah,
the volatility makes an easy story, but as you say, the technology and the change to the landscape are much more fundamental. So looking forward 3, 5, 10 years, what do you see as the potential, good and bad, of the sort of this change to the environment?
Well, there's obviously the potential that ICORadio could do an ICO and buy the BBC, clearly.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. I think we've got our first investor, folks.
I just think it has the opportunity to take out, disintermediate many markets. If I can go back to my old industry in the asset management business, in the past you'd have bought an ISA or a pension or a lump sum investment in one of my funds, and I'd have told you the annual management fee is 1.5%. And then at the end of the year you'd have got a statement and report, and you'd have seen how your investments, and buried in the tiny print was the total expense ratio is 4%. So with this type of technology, you can actually strip out potentially the accountants, the trustees, the auditors, the custodians, etc. In the music industry, I was talking earlier on, as I said, and they were saying the number of intermediaries involved between the listener and the artist. He said, no, the artist gets a fraction of the money because there's all these people in the middle. That just makes for terrible inefficiencies. A couple of the central governments we're talking to, the last thing they want is volatility on their currency. But what they want to use it as an internal accounting mechanism, and then as a way to encourage people to pay their council tax, or to actually, at a government level, to actually pay taxes so that they can remove cash from society.
Yeah.
Because, unfortunately with cash, you have a huge black market, you have fraud, you have corruption. Whatever is digitally on a ledger. It's very, very difficult to get around that sort of technology, and therefore you can actually have potentially lower taxes because everyone's paying their fair share, as opposed to only those that are actually caught by the system.
Yeah. So potentially it could be a tool and a boon for regulation and the rule of law rather than the other way around.
Well, it's rather perverse, isn't it? Because Bitcoin was originally used on this thing called the dark web. I do owe an apology to my son, because I told him to sell his half dozen Bitcoins when he was 15, because I'd never heard of them, and he then told me what the dark web was, and I said, but what on earth do you want to do with a Kalashnikov or something equally horrendous? So he sold his Bitcoins, but that's another fallacy. A lot of people think that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are used to fund nefarious activities, to fund the criminals. But if you look at all the studies, it's less than 1% of the transactions are for unaccountable, unexplained transactions. I don't know what the figure is for your average foreign exchange transactions going on in terms of money circulating around the world. But as we all know, there's a lot of people doing perhaps things which they shouldn't be doing in suitcases of cash.
Yeah, I think the figure that was mentioned on BBC Panorama at the beginning of the week was that 4%, which means that 96%, which is probably actually lower than the traditional economy. It's very interesting, isn't it, that with innovations, we often compare them, or the press often compare them with perfection rather than with reality.
Yeah. Well, and it's a lot of people say to me, yes, but what's the underlying value of say, Bitcoin, for example? And I would cite two examples that you might like to consider. The first is our European friends, whereby no firm of auditor accountants have been able to sign off the accounts of the euro because the numbers don't add up. They don't make sense. Yeah. Yet, there's 350 million of us, or certainly on the continent, exposed to the euro, and we all buy on holiday, and we're buying this bit of paper, and no one can actually get to the bottom of, well, what's its worth? What does it stand for? Yeah. And the second point, incredibly, JP Morgan came out with the figures that since the 70s, we've seen an 80% decline in the value of the US dollar. So again, just after Christmas, we saw the Venezuelan government have now issued the Petrocoin, and they're actually going to link the value of that coin to some proven oil reserves. Yeah. And by doing that, they're able to actually raise some money, and they'll actually have a coin which is basically going to be floated, and it's really going to be a proxy to crude oil prices. Yeah. When you think of it. So you're going to see some very different things which we can't sit here today and say this is what's going to happen. And yes, along the way, I would say 80% of the companies that are using blockchain technology, that are using initial coin offerings, will come into some sort of financial problem. But come on, guys and girls, that's what business is all about. Yeah. This isn't reducing the risk necessarily, but what it's doing is speeding up some innovation. And I suppose as a plug for the UK, I really hope that the regulators start really embracing this technology, because you've seen $5 billion worth of money raised. Well, at UK tax rates, that's roughly $1 billion of extra tax if it all come into the UK. Yeah. There's figures I've seen between 10 and 20,000 new jobs being created. And it's real innovation. And the UK, has probably got the best reputation for law and probably the best reputation for financial services. Yeah. And we're geographically very, very fortunate that we sit between America and Asia. And this can be seen as a centre to raise money in a controlled, regulated way. Yeah. And I think if we can start doing that, and we can then take the space back from some of these other jurisdictions where people say, oh, it's a lighter regulatory touch in some of these offshore centres. Well, it's a bit like, if I said to you, do you want to put your money in an offshore centre, or would you prefer to have it in London? Yeah.
Well, as you may know, when we came into this 5 years ago, really, in the crowdfunding space, we were in a situation where the standard regulatory reply in the UK was we have regulation, conform with it. Bye, guys. Yeah. We had that conversation in one of the committee rooms in Parliament with the regulator. And it was took a long time to get the message across that actually regulation should support innovation. Yep. And we now have the innovation unit that I proposed, first proposed, with the FCA being copied around the world. Wouldn't it be great, exactly as you say, if we can do the same here? We should lead the world.
Well, Barry, it's very interesting. I was very fortunate to be asked to the all-party parliamentary group, bit of a mouthful, a couple of weeks ago, and they'd said that they had, Lord Holmes had done some excellent work on a DLT paper, and they said we're going to look at various different sectors, like financial services, like healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And they said one thing we're not going to do, and one thing we're not going to debate over the next 2 years. It's a very, very impressive agenda. If you go onto their website, you'll see there. We're not going to talk about initial coin offerings. So questions and answers, I put my hand up and said, well, can anyone tell me if the government has suddenly found a pot of gold? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, who's going to fund all this innovation? I said, you said one of your aims is to actually increase training and education. I said, do any of you in this room know how an internal combustion engine works, or a jet engine works, or even the web that we're all using every day? People don't need to understand how the technology works. They need to understand and know that the technology can be used to help them.
Yeah.
And therefore, by actually having some guidance, as you correctly say, and regulation around initial coin offerings, then money will be raised to help speed up the adoption of some of these technologies, to make it more efficient, to make tax collection fairer. So instead of being this sort of dark thing that I want to be invisible, actually you can use it for good, and actually be much more inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to run out of time. I could talk to you for hours. It's really interesting. Final question. You've talked about some of the many, applications and uses of tokens, cryptographic tokens. Where do you see that going? And if there's one piece of advice, additionally, you'd like to leave with listeners, particularly from a business perspective or any other for that matter, what would it be?
Okay, well, if you look at the number of stocks, equities, public companies in America, there are twice the number of mutual funds. If you look at the number of stocks, equities, quoted companies in the UK, there's roughly 50% more mutual funds, unit trusts. They're called UCITS now, but I think you understand what I mean. So I've ignored pension funds, and I've ignored venture capital funds and hedge funds and all the other bits. It's a very straight standard. Look in the national paper, and you see them all listed in there. So one of the things I think we're going to see a lot more funds being issued, which will give you the diversification, which is the average investor. That's what they need. It is like gambling to pick a coin and hope you're going to get it right. You might be lucky, but the chances are you won't be. In terms of how it's going to affect the man in the street, I think the technology will just seamlessly start creeping into all parts of our lives. It's a bit like, when are we going to be impacted on artificial intelligence or Internet of Things? It's happening. And it's the same with blockchain. It's beginning to be rolled out very quietly, very carefully by many institutions. We've seen a lot of it already in the financial service sector, but there's many, many proof of concepts and proof of works going on at the moment where people are trying this, and they just roll it out to make it much more efficient. In terms of business listeners that you've got tuning in, then again, just get engaged. If you're at all confused, which I'm sure you are after me rabbiting on like this, go and talk to some people. Go and try and understand. Try and see where is it appropriate for me and my business, and what happens if my competitor comes out with suddenly they'll come out with a £10 million marketing campaign because they fund it through an ICO. Or what happens if they start issuing a digital loyalty scheme? Are they going to be able to start taking my clients? How do I stand up to them against that? Because the days of being able to advertise, on the TV or in the press and hope to catch your audience, they're kind of gone. You mentioned the Panorama program. Well, the people buying cryptocurrencies don't watch TV. They don't even watch Panorama because they consume media when they want on the go, and they consume it how they want to. So some of the social media companies, I think this is why we're seeing the likes of Google and Facebook saying we don't want to advertise in cryptocurrencies, because you suddenly get someone like Telegram come along with potentially $2 billion worth of free cash and a clean sheet to create an interactive, highly scalable social media platform. That's a threat even for someone like Facebook.
So it may be that we have to think about decentralizing or being decentralized in the future.
Sounds a bit like something out of Doctor Who, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Decentralize.
Yeah. Well, we won't exterminate anyone today, but thank you for your time.
No, thank you
for sharing some of your insights and wisdom, and I look forward to
talking
hearing
again
more
sometime
from you this evening.
All right, thanks, Barry.
Thanks.
ICO Radio was brought to you by author, speaker, transparency and clarity advocate, and award-winning software innovator Barry James. Get in touch with the programme, put yourself or someone else forward as a guest, visit iconewsdesk.com. And if you've enjoyed the show, please leave a review. And don't forget to subscribe to get your next insights and interviews from the ICO Radio podcast.